Margaret Dalton knew everything before it happened. She knew it that September afternoon in 1952 when Mr. Franklin, the manager of the Harlan Falls textile mill, walked into her grocery store, bought a pack of cigarettes, and didn't once meet her eyes. Mr. Franklin never avoided looking at people. That was what she remembered most about that afternoon. Not what he said, but what he didn't say. She watched him leave, the small bell above the door jingling its familiar note. Then silence. And she understood. The mill would close. Not next year. Not next month. Next spring. The only question left, the one that would take her 5 years to answer, was whether she should tell anyone. Harlan Falls, Ohio. If you drove along Route 30 in the 1950s, you'd pass it without noticing. No big sign, no tall water tower. Just a single main street, 2 rows of red brick houses, and the textile mill at the end of the road that, Monday through Friday, always puffed white smoke from its chimney at 6 in the morning. That smoke meant everything was running. It was what the people of Harlan Falls looked at first each morning when they drew their curtains. Not because they liked the smoke, because the smoke meant their husbands had work today. It meant the rent would be paid. It meant the baby would have milk. The small town ran on that rhythm, the rhythm of the mill, the rhythm of morning and evening shifts, the rhythm of the 7 o'clock whistle and footsteps on the sidewalk at 3 in the afternoon. Margaret Dalton had opened her grocery store on Maple Street in 1938 when she was 26 and her husband Robert had just been hired as a weaver. That was the year they got married, the year they rented the little house at the end of the street, the year she hung the small brass bell on the shop door and thought that everything was beginning. Robert died in 1944, Normandy. She kept the store open. Some things you keep doing, not because you choose to, but because stopping would hurt more than continuing. She knew that. Many women in town knew it too. That September afternoon, after Mr. Franklin left, Margaret sat down on the wooden chair behind the register and stared out the window for a long while. Outside, Maple Street looked normal. Mrs. Henderson was sweeping the sidewalk in front of her house. 2 Kowalski children were riding their bikes around a lamp post. Mr. Bennett's barber shop was open, the familiar yellow light behind the frosted glass. No one knew what she had just realized. Margaret Dalton was not one to guess. She was a woman of numbers and facts, 14 years running a grocery store, keeping handwritten ledgers, knowing exactly who owed what and who would pay on Friday. She was not afraid of the truth. But this truth was different. Harlan Falls Textile Mill employed 213 people in a town of 800. 213 meant 213 families depended on it. Rent, food, school for the children, medicine when they were sick. If the mill closed next spring, Harlan Falls would no longer be a town. It would become a place where people stayed until they found somewhere else to go. And Margaret Dalton, the woman sitting behind the register with Mr. Franklin's unpaid pack of cigarettes on the counter, was the only person in town who knew it. The question was not whether to tell. The question was who, when, and how to say it without shattering what remained. She sat with that question for 3 days. The first day, Mrs. Henderson came into the store for sugar and flour. She was 61, her hair neatly white in a bun, voice sharp in the way women who had raised many children spoke. Her husband, Harold, had worked at the mill for 27 years. He couldn't do heavy work anymore because of his back, but the mill kept him, placing him in lighter inventory duties. That's how small-town mills worked. They kept people, even when they weren't strictly needed, because that's what a community did for one another. "Busy week, Margaret?" Mrs. Henderson asked, placing a coin on the counter. "Okay," Margaret said. She watched Mrs. Henderson open her wallet, her wrinkled fingers careful with each bill, and thought, if I tell her now, what would she do? Harold was 63, his back bad. They had no nearby children, nowhere else to go. Margaret returned the change and said nothing. The second day, she stopped by Mr. Bennett's barber shop for a haircut, a monthly ritual, even if there wasn't much hair to cut. Walter Bennett had cut hair in Harlan Falls since 1931. He had a chair, a mirror, and a radio softly playing on a high shelf. He knew everyone in town, their children, their dogs, the disputes no one had asked him to know. The barber shop was where men talked when they didn't want to talk at home. "I hear the mill's having some changes," Mr. Bennett said, running a comb through her hair, eyes on the mirror. Margaret paused. "Who says?" "No one outright," he said, snipping. "But a few folks from Cincinnati have been coming down, wearing suits, not millmen." He stopped, looking at her through the mirror. "You know anything, Margaret?" It was the boldest question she had been asked. Walter Bennett was the only person in town straight enough to ask it. "Not more than you," she said. He nodded and continued cutting. No one believed her, and she knew it. On the third night, Margaret sat at the kitchen table with a cold coffee and a blank sheet of paper. She intended to make a list, not a shopping list, the kind people make when trying to think straight about an answer that doesn't exist. Left column, tell. Right column, don't tell. Left, people can prepare, find work earlier, save money. Families can talk about the future before the future comes. Right, a town that knows it is about to die will die faster. People will leave immediately. The store will close before the mill. Schools will lose students. What's left of Harlan Falls? Its final winter with window lights and laughter behind curtains will vanish faster. She stared at the paper, then folded it, left it blank. Winter 1952 came early. The first snow fell at the end of October, earlier than usual, and stayed. The streets of the town turned white in the way Margaret always found beautiful. Clean snow covering everything, making even the oldest rooftops look new. But this winter was different. She noticed in small ways. Families started buying less at the store. Not much, just a little. The way people tighten belts when they're unsure but already sensing something. Mill orders dropped. She knew from truck drivers stopping by for water and gossiping in their way. Mr. Franklin stopped coming into the store, and in the evenings the lights in homes along Maple Street turned off earlier. Not much. 15 minutes. 20. The way people go to bed early when they don't want to think anymore. Margaret stood behind the counter, counting lit windows each night, Not because she wanted to, because she couldn't not count. In December, Mrs. Henderson came in to borrow money. Not the first time that year. Harold was sick, his back worse. This time a doctor in Canton, not cheap. "I'll pay in January," Mrs. Henderson said, "when Harold gets his check." Margaret looked at her. The 2-column list appeared in her mind. Left column, right column. If I tell her now that there won't be a paycheck in January, she wouldn't borrow. She would plan differently. Maybe call her daughter in Cleveland. Maybe sell something. Maybe prepare. Or collapse right here, in my store, in December 1952, 10 days before Christmas. "Okay," Margaret said. She took the money from the drawer. Not the easiest decision she had made, but not the hardest either. The hardest was when Mrs. Henderson thanked her and left, the bell jingling, and Margaret watched, knowing that debt would never be repaid. Not because Mrs. Henderson was bad, but because next spring there would be no paycheck to pay. The official notice came March 14th, 1953. A paper posted on the mill door early morning before the first shift. Mr. Franklin was not there. She heard he had returned to Cincinnati the night before. Margaret knew because she opened the store at 7, and within 15 minutes the whole town came in. Not to buy anything, just to be near someone. That's what people did in big moments. They sought familiar places, familiar faces, as if familiarity could keep the world from shaking too hard. Mrs. Henderson came in and sat in the wooden chair by the window, the chair she always used waiting for Harold on Fridays. She said nothing, just sat. Margaret stood behind the counter and looked at her town. Mr. Bennett arrived, standing near the door, hands in pockets. He looked at her through the crowd. No questions, just looking. The look carried a question. She knew it already, didn't she? But he didn't say it. She did not answer the unasked question. Spring, 1953. Harlan Falls textile mill closed. Within 18 months, 140 families left town. The elementary school had 1 class instead of 3. The pharmacy closed. The Methodist church merged with the Baptist, 2 shrinking congregations needing each other. Margaret Dalton kept the grocery store open until 1961. Not because business was good, but because if the store closed, there would be nothing left on the main street to remind people a town had existed there. There was one thing Margaret Dalton never told anyone. Not that she knew beforehand. Mr. Bennett had guessed, never saying outright. But this. In the winter of 1952, in those months she knew but stayed silent, Harlan Falls had the best months in her memory. Not because anything joyful happened, but because everyone, knowing nothing, prepared for nothing, lived fully in those months. Christmas 1952. Maple Street lights stayed on until 11 at night. The church was full. Mrs. Henderson baked pies for the store to share, the kind she only made in plentiful years. The Kowalski children sang Christmas carols in front of Mr. Bennett's house, red-nosed from the cold, breaths forming little clouds in the winter air. Mr. Bennett gave each 5 cents and stood in the doorway watching them for a long while after they left. Margaret watched from the shop window. She thought, if I had told, Christmas would have been different. Then she thought, or am I just telling myself what I want to believe? That was the question she carried for the next 50 years. No answer, only questions. I first visited Harlan Falls in the summer of 1987. I was a junior in college, writing a thesis on declining industrial towns in Ohio. My professor gave me a list, 20 towns that lost over half their population after mills closed in the 1950s to 60s. Harlan Falls was 7th on the list. I arrived in the afternoon. The main street was empty, a few houses vacant. The mill at the end of the street had become rubble after a fire in 1971, weeds growing through cracks in the concrete. But the grocery store was still open. The little brass bell on the door jingled as I entered. A 75-year-old woman with white hair sat on a wooden chair, ledger on her lap. She looked up. "Need something?" she asked. "I'm researching the town," I said. "The mill. May I ask you a few questions?" She looked at me for a moment. "Sit down," she said, pointing to the chair by the window. We talked for 2 hours. She spoke of the mill, the families who left, the elementary school, the church, Mr. Bennett, who moved to Akron in 1955 and sent Christmas cards every year until his death in 1971. I asked why she decided to keep the store open. She paused. "Not a decision," she said. "Just what I do every morning." I asked if she ever regretted it, staying, the things she lost by staying. She looked out the window. Late afternoon on Maple Street. A few yellow leaves drifting across the empty street. "I regret something else," she said. I waited, but she didn't say more. A little bell jingled. An elderly man walked in, bought cigarettes, nodded to her, walked out. The bell jingled again. We watched him to the end of the street. "Mr. Pearson," she said. "He's been here since before the war. One of the 17 left." 17. In a town that once had 800. I left Harlan Falls at dusk. In the car, I wrote in my notebook, "Margaret Dalton, grocery store, open since 1938. Still open. Ask about regrets. No answer." I added a line, crossed it out, wrote it again. She knew something she didn't say. Didn't know if it was right or wrong. Maybe she didn't even know. Margaret Dalton closed the grocery store in the fall of 1991. Not because she wanted to, but because her knees could no longer let her stand behind the counter all day. She died in 1994, age 82, in the little house at the end of Maple Street she and Robert had rented in 1938. In her will, she left the brass bell from the store to the Harlan Falls Library, the only place still open in Harlan Falls at the time. No note, no explanation, just the bell. I have thought of Margaret Dalton many times since that summer afternoon in 1987. Not because she was a hero, not because she was a villain, but because she stood in between, knowing what others did not, choosing silence and living a lifetime with the question of whether that silence was kindness or cowardice. And perhaps what made me think of her most is what she never told me that day, what she regretted. I do not know what it was. Maybe keeping silent, maybe lending money to Mrs. Henderson she knew would never be repaid. Maybe Christmas 1952. The night light stayed on until 11. and she stood behind the shop window watching children sing in falling snow, knowing that next spring everything would be different. Maybe she didn't regret her choice. Maybe she regretted that none of the choices were fully right or wrong. That sometimes the best person in the room can still be wrong. That sometimes knowing in advance protects no one, not even the one who knows. The brass bell from the Dalton grocery store now hangs in the Harlan Falls library. The library is open Tuesdays and Thursdays, 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. If you go and pull the door, it still rings, just like the very first day.